like birds and not sluggish like reptiles.
See where they came from, how they live, and unravel the mystery of their disappearance. This fall, you won't want to miss Space Age and the Dinosaurs.
The full intensity of the 1992 election campaign is upon us, and State Senator Jean Lloyd Jones is challenging incumbent Senator Charles Grassley. He's looking for a third term in Washington. She joins us to discuss her candidacy, so join us for our weekly edition of Iowa Press, Sunday at noon and at 7 that night on Iowa Public Television.
Stay tuned for more TV worth watching right here on Iowa Public Television, a resource for Iowa's future.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television and by United Healthcare of Iowa, a partner in bringing you the best in public affairs programs, encourages you to join with them in supporting quality public television.
Never underestimate the power of incumbency. President Bush is still well behind Governor Clinton in the polls. The economic news is still terrible, despite a small drop in the unemployment rate, but the president went on an executive spending spree this week that, as the Washington Post puts it, made him look like a department store Santa Claus in December. The president's gifts included the promise that Texans will build F-16s, destined for Taiwan, and export subsidies for American wheat farmers. Juan, will playing Santa Claus pay off for Mr. Bush on Election Day?
So far, so good, Gordon. So far, so good for Mr. Bush. Many of the things he's done are defensible, and the voters appreciate it in the midst of a recession. But some of the things he's got planned, including sending F-15s to Saudi Arabia, could really stir the pot in this election year.
Carl?
The gains will be marginal, if any, because even if he doles out $30 billion in South Florida, it will not get to the right people soon enough. And the wheat subsidies are mostly phony, as the farmers will find out.
Charles?
Of course it's going to help, Gordon. That's why the presidents have been doing this for 2 centuries. And it's also why we shouldn't be too shocked that the current incumbent is doing it in 1992.
Nina?
Well, I think the voters may well understand that that Santa Claus is not really Santa Claus, that it's just a costume, but they'll be glad it's Christmas anyway.
President Bush returned to hurricane-ravaged South Florida this week, where, among other things, he promised to rebuild Homestead Air Force Base, which, unless I'm mistaken, was on the list of bases to be closed. Mr. Bush insisted that he was keeping hurricane relief, however, out of the political arena.
I'm not even going to take any political questions. I have tried, and I know the governor has, the senators have, congressmen standing with me have. Tried to keep it out of the political arena. And I have no comment whatsoever, except simply to say we're here to help, and I really mean that. This is nothing to do with partisanship. It has everything to do with helping the families, some of whom are standing right here today, and we're going to try to keep it that way.
So this is, according to the president, just humanitarian activity.
Look, Gordon, of course all this is politics, but let's be adults about this. I worked for Walter Mondale in the 1980 campaign, and America is strewn with shopping centers, sports complexes, harbor developments, and other monuments to the generosity of the Carter-Mondale campaign of 1980. So this is the way the game is played.
In fact, I think Teddy Kennedy sued Carter after that. They tried to sue him because he was giving so much away. But I mean, you go back in history, you look at what Truman did, you look at what Johnson did, you look at what FDR did. We have Social Security because of what incumbents do with the largesse and patronage they have at their hands.
But meanwhile, there are troops down there doing some good work for the people who were damaged, who were hurt in the hurricane.
But let us be very clear about what we're doing here and not pretend that just because it's business as usual, it's just wonderful. We are going to rebuild a base at a cost of $1 billion, which is more than the savings from all the bases we closed at great pain all this year. It is a base that probably would have been closed anyway. The president...
They need jobs down there in Florida.
They do need jobs. Somebody might argue that you should spend the money on something that would be more worthy in the long term, because that base could be closed eventually anyway. Secondly, I must say it troubles me a bit that the president would not alienate the Chinese when he was asked by Congress to allow students to stay here on a permanent status basis. But he's perfectly willing to alienate the Chinese to sell a few planes to Taiwan in an election year where he thinks it's going to help him.
Well, let me say that, of course, you're right. Nothing is going to happen between now and November that is not politics. And I don't care whether Bush does it or Clinton does it. It is cynical politics to decide he's going to rebuild a base that was slated for closing. But it would have been the dumbest politics in American history for him not to say, I'm going to build that base, given the situation in Florida, where those electoral votes are so crucial in this election.
The networks were kind enough to put the president on television this week to talk about the disaster. He reached 47 million Americans. Mr. Clinton went on television for, about 9 seconds. All he could say was, I'll be ready for the next disaster if I happen to be president.
When Clinton wins, he'll do this in 4 years. So
in spades.
Exactly.
Well, you sure he's going to win?
If he wins.
And let me say, Gordon, those 9 seconds, though, were not too bad for Clinton. When he talked about this flip-flop on the grain subsidies, he said, I'm a Baptist, so I believe in deathbed confessions or turnaround
conversions. We'll have the
conversions.
Quote later. Yeah.
But this is ridiculous. I mean, in 9 seconds, he got in some licks that you can't get in sometimes in 15 minutes.
Let's say a word about the airplane sale, because I think there's more here than just a crass election year politics. I suspect that the sale of planes to Taiwan and the sale, which will be announced probably next week, of the planes to Saudi Arabia, would have happened even if it weren't an election year. And I think the real problem here is it's a sign of our decline as a great power, that the sale of arms to countries in hostile areas of the world ought to be determined purely by national security considerations, but it isn't anymore. It used to be, but we are now in such economic straits that we have to sell the planes simply for pure economic reasons, the way third world countries have to do that.
Well, in fact, that's part of the campaign strategy being pursued by Mr. Bush and Dan Quayle right now. What they're saying to the voters is, in many cases, Clinton is going to cut your jobs by cutting defense spending in many key areas. And he's saying to people at Homestead, listen, I'm willing to rebuild this base. Mr. Clinton might not be. I think it's damaging in the long run, because especially when you look at the wheat subsidies, I don't think there's any way to defend that given the administration's prior stand. The administration, in fact, has agents in Europe right now negotiating on the GATT treaty, trying to tell people end subsidies and angering all our allies across the nation.
Will it play with the voters?
It'll play with the voters in the short run. The question is, when people figure out that Mr. Bush had no commitment to these domestic issues for many years and suddenly doing it in election year, do they suddenly say, well, you know what, this is far too hypocritical for me to stomach?
And let me point out, as Nina has alluded to, his stance with regard to China has never been anything other than to prop up, to give preferred treatment to an oppressive regime. All of a sudden now he's willing to anger that regime by selling F-16s to Taiwan. I will concede, Charles, that under any circumstance we might have offered those planes to Saudi Arabia, but I don't think anything but election politics promotes this business of those planes going to Taiwan.
Well, just a word in Mr. Bush's defense. He did say that there had been a sale of jets to China recently, and it had offset and tipped that balance, and therefore they needed to sell some jets to Taiwan.
Did you see the Census Bureau report? The number of Americans living below the poverty level is now approaching 36 million, the highest since 1964.
Well, I think we have to make sure to say here that we're not talking about the same poverty level as Somalia. When we talk about the domestic poverty level, we're talking about people who earn less than $13,000 a year. Families that earn less than $13,000 a year. And that doesn't count a lot of the government subsidies, food stamps, et cetera, that they might get. But still, it's an indicator of where the economy is going. It's in the toilet.
Yeah, well, it's an indicator of recession. The numbers went up also between 1978 and 82, at the end of the Carter years to beginning of the Reagan years, when there was also a recession. It's nothing other than a recession indicator.
Charles, just for a moment on these Census Bureau figures, now they say poor Americans amount to 14.2% of the population. 40% of the Americans are children. Poor Americans are children.
Well, as Nina indicated, there's a real distortion in these numbers because it doesn't count the huge amounts of money that the government gives to poor people. It's $200 billion a year uncounted, which amounts to about $11,000 a year for every poor person in America, uncounted. And it leads to real absurdities. The poor, as defined by these numbers, 40% of them own their own houses. The average poor person in America has more living space than the average Japanese, not poor Japanese, average Japanese. The average poor American is more likely to own a car than the average European, not the poor European, the average European. These are distorted numbers, and they look really good in headlines, but they don't in any way reflect the misery level in the country.
Wait a minute now. For all my life, I've been hearing all this junk about comparing somebody with someone in Somalia or Japan. I don't live in...
Japan is not Somalia.
These people don't live in Japan. They don't live in Somalia. They don't live in any third world country. And these figures... The current line is the figures are skewed. What happens is they look at a family, usually a family with two people working, and they're earning $8,000 a year. So they say this is a poor American. As soon as somebody gives them some food stamps or some AFDC, and it brings them up to a mathematical figure of 13,200, you say don't count them as poor anymore.
No, it's not mathematical.
That's mathematical sophistry.
It's a question of standard of living. If you include medical care and you include housing and you include food stamps, the standard of living is a lot higher than it looks otherwise.
Well, no matter which way you go with it, it was bad news for George Bush to have the economy come out that way, and pretty good news for Bill Clinton, because it reminded everybody that this campaign is about the economy.
Except Bill Clinton had a bad week on the question of the draft. Is he a draft dodger? Question will not go away. Just when he thinks he's put this issue to rest, it pops up again. This week, the Los Angeles Times had a story to the effect that Clinton's late uncle got him a slot in the Naval Reserve so that he would be able to bypass the draft. Clinton's response was this.
I can tell you this, I have told the truth about my draft status, and I have told you the only military option that I ever considered or that I was ever offered was the one I have reported to you. That's it.
Bill Clinton does have a credibility problem. He is going to have to come clean to the American people. He's going to have to answer these questions.
And you yourself were in the National Guard there.
Yeah. See, I answered all the questions.
Nina, he did answer all the questions. 4 years ago, he was hammered into the ground with this.
Look, this is a legitimate issue. It involves his truth-telling. Clinton's truth-telling. It's not going to go away, but I suspect it's not going to be dispositive either. And let me just say, I got the task of investigating Dan Quayle's draft background or lack of draft background. And when you investigate this stuff, what you find out is that these young people at that time period were in a crisis in their lives. And it is very difficult to parse out what happened and what didn't happen, which of their relatives did what, and what they knew about, and we're never going to get this entirely straight.
Can anything in the world be quieter than Dan Quayle and Bill Clinton swapping war stories? It's not his war, right? But look, the fact is that Bill Clinton right now is extremely vulnerable on this issue. Charlie Black, who's running Bush's campaign, said, you know, reporters, go at it. And the LA Times served its purpose as well this week by going back and getting Ray Clinton, the uncle, and finding out that the uncle's lawyer said, yes, in fact, Bill Clinton, when he got out of Georgetown in 1968, God, I think it was 5 times longer than anybody else on average on Arkansas before he was able to go take his pre-induction physical. And that allowed him to go off to Oxford. It allowed him to really avoid the draft.
Suppose Clinton had said at the beginning, look, I had a choice between going to Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar and going to Vietnam to get shot at. What would you have done?
Hey,
suppose he'd handle it that way.
Yeah, but it's not that way. That wasn't the choice. I mean, you have to understand. The deferment was gone.
It wouldn't have been acceptable to me.
The deferment was gone by that time for people who want to do postgraduate study. That was his dilemma. He wanted to get to Oxford, and he wanted to get there quick, and it looks like he may have taken a cheap route.
What will determine how the issue comes out is how the press treats it. The kind of sympathetic approach which Nina gave, and which I would agree with, that it was a really difficult time, and it was a hard choice, and it's hard to be retrospectively tough on either of these guys, is not, however, how the press looked at it in '88 when Quayle was around. He didn't get any sympathy for his dilemmas and his difficulties. But it depends now really on how the press approaches it. If they go into this story again and it's up to the press to either to bring it up or to bury it. That'll determine if it stays alive. Otherwise, it'll go away as an issue.
It is so hard today for young Americans to remember how many young Americans opposed the war in Vietnam. Some went to Canada, some simply defied it, some got college deferments. I listened to an older man.
And some, like Al Gore, who opposed it, went anyway.
Yes, and but it is very difficult for me to see the Vice President Quayle or George Bush making an awful lot of this particular issue.
They don't have to, Carl. Somebody in an independent expenditure committee will make ads out of it.
I don't think you're being fair here. Listen, the LA Times wasn't going after anybody with a vendetta. There's a real question here, not about whether or not you supported or opposed the Vietnam War. The question is about Clinton's credibility. Why we keep peeling the onion and finding things.
I said that to begin with, Juan. I said this is a legitimate issue about his truth-telling, but Carl said that the Bush campaign would go after him on it, and I simply made the point that they don't have to.
I said they don't have any grounds to go after him. Quayle's got no record that justifies it.
George Bush does.
Bush's sons don't have any
George
record.
Bush does. George Bush is the candidate.
We'd like to know who's telling the truth in this campaign. So would everybody else. But we've already established that President Bush seems to be stretching the truth when he says that Bill Clinton raised taxes as governor of Arkansas 128 times. But, you know, is Clinton telling the truth when he says President Bush secretly plans to devastate the middle class, that he's going to have to cut or gut Medicare or Social Security? Juan.
Well, you know, look, it's politics time. As Carl said earlier in the broadcast, everything's political between now and Election Day. And what you see is that on issues ranging from Clinton in the draft to Jennifer Flowers, Clinton's been in doubt, and certainly with these class attacks about scaring up the elderly in the country and saying that Bush is going to devastate Social Security or Medicare, I don't see the truth of it. But I don't see the truth of George Bush saying that Bill Clinton raised taxes 128 times. I mean, if you get down to the nuts, as Michael Kinsley's done in several columns, you just see it's not true. In addition to which, if you use the same standard, George Bush has raised taxes maybe even more.
All right. Well, you know, it's all the hyperbole. You get this situation. There's no way in the world that George Bush is going to devastate Social Security and so forth. Nobody can get away with that politically. Yet you've got Pat Robertson, who says the Democrats have a secret plan to destroy the American family. I mean, you got to take all of this.
They're too late. It's already happened.
All right. On the debates, Bill Clinton is ready to debate. He wants 3 and 1 with the vice president. The Bush campaign is balking on that.
Well, the Bush campaign is paranoid. They're terrified. They don't like the idea of a debate. And with good reason. Ronald Reagan essentially won on his debate. The poll numbers in 1980 showed that Carter had closed the gap. They were just about dead even. And when the American people saw that Ronald Reagan wasn't some scary right-wing crazy nut, they decided they'd go ahead and put their faith in him and try something different.
George Bush, you're no Ronald Reagan.
And the Bush people are terrified that if the American people see Clinton and he does reasonably well and he looks like a grown-up and a responsible person, that the whole distrust issue will be gone and that people will decide to take a chance on
I think you're being a little bit harsher, Nina. I really do. I don't think that George Bush is afraid. I don't think George Bush is afraid of Bill Clinton. I think it's more a case they don't like the format. They don't want one person, a moderator, separating Bush and Clinton. They want a panel of reporters there, as it was done last time. But it's also true that Bush is on the ropes, as you say, but I think a candidate who's on the ropes wants the debates.
Well, all the Bush people I've talked to do not want
the other analogy
there's no way to get out of it. But
is 1960, where John Kennedy, in his debates, established himself as at least equal to Nixon, who of course had a problem with his makeup and his sweating. But it made Kennedy a plausible candidate, as it did Reagan in 1980, and I think that they understand that automatically it's going to happen with Clinton. But there's no way around that. There's going to have to be at least one debate, so it's going to happen at least the once that Clinton is going to be up there with the President of the United States, and he's going to be on a level of equality.
Well, I can understand why President Bush would be reluctant to go into these debates. I mean, Ronald Reagan had it great. Carter was in trouble. He could ask Americans, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? That's a question George Bush does not want to answer.
I'll tell you who else is terrified is Al Gore.
Al Gore.
Al Gore is terrified of a
Because
debate
of expectations,
too. Because of the expectations. He figures that all that Quayle has to do is show up and be halfway reasonable, and he'll have won. And the Gore people have looked at all the past Quayle debates, and they see that Quayle beat Birch Bayh in a Senate debate, and Birch Bayh is no boob. He's not an easy person to beat.
And also, Clinton did well in the debates as in the earlier part of this election year against Brown and the other Democrats. So he's got a good record going.
And there's one more question President Bush does not want to answer, and it's crucial. What are you going to do differently in the next 4 years that you didn't do in the past 4 years?
You see, the other half of this debate, though, that you keep pointing out questions that Bush doesn't want to answer, I think Bush can give you answers. I think the other side of this is that Bill Clinton doesn't want a group of reporters out there who are going to bring up a lot of the old demons and really serve as surrogates for George Bush. And that's why he wants to get it down as close as possible to him versus Bush up on that stage.
Bush is used to the press conference format, and that's why he wants a lot of people out there questioning him.
Let me say before we go a word on Joe Rao. Joseph Rao died this week in Washington at the age of 81. He was a champion in many respects, but of course he was a champion of civil rights as well. Could we say a word on behalf of Joe?
Well, you know, I've known Joe Rao in Washington since I first got here. And even though he offended a lot of people from time to time, he was a great liberal warhorse, the conscience of the Democratic Party. There was no cause that he believed in that he would not literally lay his life down for, and he was not in it for himself, unlike a great many people in this town. He was in it for what he viewed as justice.
And let me tell you, in good times or bad, white backlashes, black power, or whatever, Joe Rao never walked away from his belief in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights.
Washington is a city with not a lot of people who stand on principle, and now it's lost one.
You know, Joe Rao went to the Democratic Convention in 1964 and fought for the Freedom Democrats from Mississippi. He fought for the poor black man in this country, fought for the District of Columbia.
Nina, the state of California is writing checks again. I remember when that state, under Governor Jerry Brown, had a huge surplus. What happened out there?
Well, they passed Proposition 13, and now localities can't raise their own property taxes to pay for services that they want, so it fell on the state. The state ran out of money, and everybody's squabbling. And it's most unseemly, and neither the Republican governor nor the Democratic legislature comes out of this looking really wonderful. But I think we should understand that there are some real philosophical differences here between the Republicans, who want to keep taxes very low because they think that will attract more business, and the Democrats, who view the future of the state as preserving its educational system and that as a way to attract more business. And these are real philosophical differences. Because people act petty doesn't mean that there aren't genuine ideas at stake here.
Are we seeing the future of the nation in California?
Probably. It's certainly the future of the nation if we pass a balanced budget amendment, that's for sure.
Well, you're seeing the future also in the fact that they haven't solved their problems in California. The state's deeply in debt. It's going to go further in debt. And we've talked about all the Santa Claus stuff, the billions that are going to Florida, etc. That money is going to increase the U.S. national debt and the budget deficit, and make have no doubts about that. In California, their compromise leaves some serious cuts in the education funding of that particular state.
And it shows the term limits don't solve a thing, because even though they may not be running for the same office in a few years, they're trying to run for other offices.
Well, that's the future of California right there, is term limits. And it's going to get rid of these politicians. And I don't know that it's going to solve or make for good government, but I think that's what the people of California believe.
Charles? Another piece of the future here is Pete Wilson, who I think has elevated himself in stature and may be a viable candidate for '96 for the presidency. He showed the country the kind of leadership that Bush has not. He stood on principle and said, I'm not going to raise taxes, I'm going to cut spending, and he held out for 2 months against all kinds of abuse and ended up by standing on principle. At the end, he had to make a smaller compromise, but he got his way. The president runs around whining that the that the Congress made him raise taxes, and then he proclaims himself as a cutter of spending, and then, as has been indicated earlier, he goes around throwing billions around.
Charles, I guess first of all we should point out that Pete Wilson ran into some of the same problems that President Bush did with the conservatives in his party for raising taxes last year. So,
but he took a stand, and I think he did the way. I mean, he held spending the way that the president has not held spending. I think that's a real difference.
No, but there's a big problem here, which is that the California economy went in the dumps, and Pete Wilson...
the American economy has gone in the dumps, too.
And Pete Wilson was the guy who came in there and said he knew how to gin that engine, how to get things going. He has not done it, and I think a lot of Californians hold him and the Republican Party responsible, which is the reason that George Bush can't count on California when it comes to Election Day this November.
Well, I agree with you that Wilson has stood for things and has been really very tough-minded, first in raising taxes and next in holding the line on spending, but I fear that that will not be rewarded.
You know, are we, I've heard it said that we of the media are being too tough on President Bush now, just as it was said some time ago that we were giving him a free ride. Now it is said that we're giving Governor Clinton a free ride. Is there any truth to this?
Yeah, I think, well, it's not that we're being too tough on the president. I think he's made a lot of mistakes, and he's deserved a lot of the criticism that he's gotten for his rhetoric and for his actions. But I think that Clinton has gotten something of a ride starting in July with the big boost at the convention. And I don't think it's the liberal bias. I think it's that the press goes, like most Americans, with winners. And when somebody is on the way up, he gets a more favorable approach than somebody who isn't.
And if you want a good example of that, look at 1988. Nobody got trashed more consistently than Michael Dukakis. And George Bush was the winner that year.
Yeah, but let me point out also that sometimes all the press has to do is tell the truth and state some facts to get this kind of criticism. I can sit here, you can sit here and say, George Bush does not stand for any principle. I don't know what the man really believes. We aren't the only ones saying this. I can find you 1 million Republicans out there who say this.
Well, I think there's a bigger problem here, which is generational, which is a lot of reporters are about that 48-year-old age of Mr. Clinton, and I think a lot of people see Mr. Bush as older, different generation. He's a war guy. I think people don't necessarily want to plug into, hit on Bill Clinton when it comes to the abortion issue. They see George Bush is kind of anti-popular culture with the Dan Quayle and the Murphy Brown episode. Well, all these things, it seems to me, work with a popular newsroom culture against George Bush.
If it were just generational, I'd have to be sitting here singing George Bush's praises.
Let me make a prediction that when Bush starts rising in the polls or closing the gap, there's going to be a change in the tone of the coverage.
Well, you have to tell the truth when it happens. You go to a Republican convention, there's enormous divisiveness. You report that, oh, suddenly you're a rat. You show at the Democratic convention that they've got an unusually unified convention. Oh, you're pro-Clinton. Pooey.
Pooey? Well, that's the last word on Inside Washington. Thanks. See you next week.
Beginning next week, Inside Washington will begin 1 hour earlier. Watch Inside Washington each Saturday at 5:30. That's beginning next week. Right now, stay tuned for more musical memories from Lawrence Welk and his TV family.
Acquisition of this program was made possible by Friends of Iowa Public Television and by United Healthcare of Iowa, a partner in bringing you the best in public affairs programs, encourages you to join with them in supporting quality public television.
The full intensity of the 1992 election campaign is upon us, and State Senator Jean Lloyd Jones is challenging incumbent Senator Charles Grassley. He's looking for a third term in Washington. She joins us to discuss her candidacy, so join us for our weekly edition of Iowa Press, Sunday at noon and at 7 that night on Iowa Public Television.
In 1989, this Princeton graduate came up with an improbable notion.
This nation needs a national teacher corps.
Her idea was met with great enthusiasm.
Kid, you're deranged.
A nation's committed youth confront the crisis in our schools. Who will teach for America?
Part of Back to School Week, Monday at 8.
Look around and you'll see the future. in the hands of those who are just starting to explore, in the eyes of those just beginning to wonder. Some will take dreams we've yet to have and make them come true. Others will answer questions we haven't begun to ask. Of course, we have no way of finding the next Edison, or the next Ellington, Austin, or Van Gogh. Not until they've discovered their own special talent, their own unique voice. So we do our best. And one of the things we do is give them a place where they can find that